This is a scary story that I witnessed myself. My grandmother's house and my friend Jin's grandfather's house were opposite each other. We were the same age and our parents were both divorced and living far away, who abandoned us, of course. We had so many similarities, so we also became good friends. Jin had a pale face and looked a bit malnourished. She lived with her grandfather, who was aggressive, and his way of upbringing was mainly beating and scolding. The one time I was most impressed was when I was doing my homework in my room and I heard someone swearing downstairs very loudly. Hearing the voice, I knew it was Jin's grandfather. He scolded her again, hitting and scolding her aggressively in public. Jin didn't resist, didn't run away, but only bowed her head to receive the beating. Some people in the neighborhood saw this and were deeply saddened, immediately stopping and tried to convince Jin's grandfather to stop being so violent towards her. But he was a stubborn, selfish and very aggressive person. Anyone who dared to stop him would be scolded and cursed with harsh words. "If anyone ever challenges me, I will beat them and I will beat the child, so get out of here!" Therefore, the people around him also didn't want to be involved in what he did. 1 year ago, I was also beaten like this, beaten until my eyes were black and blue. I couldn't accept this, so I understood what Jin was going through. The two of us decided to run away to the roof of a building when we wanted to escape. It was our secret little attic. Jin's heart was obviously filled with hatred towards her grandfather, including her parents who abandoned her and made her miserable as she was then. Every time she was beaten by him, she would record it in a notebook, which the purpose of was to avenge when the time would come. Jin hid it in the corner of the closet in the attic where no one could find it. Later, as we were growing up, when I was in my freshman year of college, I took a vacation to visit my grandmother, and from there, I discovered Jin's terrible secret. She dropped out of high school after entering society. We rarely saw each other. We hardly had any contact with each other anymore. As soon as I went upstairs that day, I saw Jin's grandfather's door with a white wreath like a house in mourning. When I got to Grandma's house, I asked how it was Jin's. At this time, I knew that Jin's grandfather was dead. This made me surprised, so I asked her why he died. I just thought he died of old age at first, but I didn't think it was a suicide. Before he was discovered, he had been hanging for several days. Everyone said that they were also surprised because with Mr. Jin's character, he would never hang himself to commit suicide. Jin, after hearing that I had returned to his hometown, came to me to inquire about the situation. She looked indescribable then, as she was 180 degrees different from when she was in high school and looked like a gangster senior. Seeing Mr. Jin die, I wanted to comfort her so that she would be less sad and not blame herself. But she didn't seem sad. She even felt comfortable being alone. Jin's face looked very relaxed. Not a single tear had fell. And she also told the truth, that she wished her grandfather had died sooner. After a year, we were completely different, could not find a common topic anymore, and the conversations that we would have ran dry. Jin was busy with work, so she left first, leaving me alone in the old attic. But I felt curious. I really wanted to know, what did Jin go through all those years? I didn't know if she still had the habit of writing in that diary, but was the diary maybe still hidden in that drawer? Opening the cabinet, I couldn't help but be surprised. There was a scarecrow dangling inside, a creepy one. There was plenty of bloodstains on the straw scarecrow. Then, I also found Jin's diary in the closet. I nervously opened it and was surprised at what was written inside. It recorded the method of using blood and a scarecrow to curse someone, and the cursed person would die just like the scarecrow. The hanging scarecrow looked like Jin's grandfather and was hanging in the same way. I started to understand what had happened when I heard someone's voice behind me. While I was in my own thought, my neighbor, Auntie Liu, was upstairs to get some clothing. She startled me. The contents of the notebook made me confused. I did not believe that Jin could kill a grandfather like that. I didn't dare ask Jin about this, nor tell anyone. I could only put the diary back in its place, pretending I didn't see it. After that, we hardly saw each other ever again. Sometimes we did have a little contact, but just politeness because she scared me. She also said in her diary that she would use the same method to deal with her parents, whom she hates very much. I really don't know how to solve this problem.
The story was told by my friend named Frog. Frog said that at that time, he was only 6 or 7 years old and had just finished the school year. Because Frog's parents were busy with work in the city. During winter and summer breaks, Frog would stay with his grandparents in a small town in the district. On the day of the incident, Frog was sound asleep next to his grandma, and it was probably already midnight. Suddenly, Frog felt like there was something staring at him, a strange and peculiar sensation. The feeling of being stared at intensely woke Frog up slowly. But when he opened his eyes, everything was pitch black, and after getting used to the darkness there, Frog looked around. Frog turned his eyes around to find the source of this strange feeling, until Frog saw a large wooden cabinet across the bed. There was something black lying on top of it, and this eerie feeling originated from there. At first, Frog thought it was just an object, but upon closer inspection, he realized that there was something truly unsettling about it. It resembled a deflated balloon, lacking a body and appearing vague. Then it slowly materialized, and the features on its face resembled a wrinkled and unpleasant expression. Gradually, those expressions became increasingly fierce and terrifying. Frog immediately trembled with fear and pulled the blanket to cover himself almost entirely. Despite that, Frog was still terrified. No matter how small he was, when seeing those things, surely everyone would be scared because Frog's grandfather often told him stories about ghosts. Frog dared not look up there anymore, so he pulled the blanket tightly and covered himself completely. But he still felt intensely watched. Frog told his grandma about it the next morning, and she became worried upon hearing it, then hurriedly called his grandfather. His grandfather furrowed his brow after hearing this and took a package of newspaper from the top of the cabinet. Frog's grandfather, who liked to find old things and created a collection of antique items, but in reality, it was just a pile of worthless things. Then his grandfather carefully opened the package, revealing a clay jar inside. However, as soon as the jar was opened, Frog had a very bad premonition. Then the grandfather put the item away, but Frog didn't know where he put it and thought it was over. 4 or 5 days later, Frog drank a lot of water before going to bed. As a result, in the middle of the night, unable to hold it any longer, Frog got up to go to the bathroom. At that moment, Frog suddenly noticed that a basement door had opened, and inside, there was a faint blue light amid. At only 7 or 8 years old, Frog had a horrifying curiosity, so he pushed the door open and looked inside. Surprisingly, when Frog opened the door, the blue light suddenly disappeared, and since it was still quite dark outside, Frog happened to turn on the light. But there was nothing in the basement, and there was no movement. So Frog thought maybe he saw it wrong and turned off the light to go back to bed. However, as soon as the light went out, Frog noticed that something seemed to be hiding in the dark corner of the basement and staring at him. Fearful, Frog quickly turned on the light again, but when the light came on, there was still nothing inside. As soon as the light went out again, a dark shadow with eerie red eyes suddenly appeared. Frog turned on the light again, but didn't see anything. Frog didn't know what was happening. In an instant, Frog felt his hair standing on end, and the feeling of fear became intense and unstoppable. Immediately after, Frog's hand trembled, and he turned off the light once more. Unexpectedly, underneath, two strange red spots appeared. In the moment of darkness, an image of a pale, distorted face was charging towards Frog. Frog's heart suddenly tightened, and his nerves, stretched to the limit, finally snapped. A loud scream echoed throughout the house. After the scream, Frog passed out, and what happened next was recounted by his grandma when he grew up. At that time, his grandparents woke Frog up. Seeing Frog unconscious, his grandma immediately got angry and scolded his grandfather. It turned out that a few days earlier, Frog's grandfather didn't want to throw away the jar, so he left it in the basement. That night, Frog's grandparents couldn't wake Frog up, so they had to call a witch from the town to awaken him. After Frog woke up, he had a high fever for 2 days, but after the fever subsided, he never saw that terrifying thing again. Although this happened a long time ago, every time he recalls those scenes, Frog still gets goosebumps. Frog said that he would never dare to wake up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom again. My friends and I asked Frog what the jar was and if it was a normal jar. Frog replied that he didn't know, and it seems like his grandparents had thrown the jar away. Perhaps the situation was resolved by the witch. The village we lived in had many eerie secrets that we only heard vaguely about. Moreover, it was a forbidden mountainous area, where many valuable artifacts were buried from ancient times, adding to the supernatural elements. It seems that there are terrifying things existing in our homes that we have yet to see.
This scary story happened in a fishing village in China a few years ago. There was a woman who had been waiting for someone under the lighthouse at the pier for 7 days. She was the wife of Fang, a fisherman. On the day Fang set sail, his boat was suddenly hit by a storm and had not returned for 7 days. Although her son advised her to return home, the wife still waited there. Fang's wife had been waiting on the pier for 7 days now. Each time she was dragged home by her son to stop waiting. This village was a typical fishing village of Fujian province, China. The people were all fishing on the sea, so sometimes shipwrecks were inevitable. Finally, the bad news came on the 8th day. The son then panicked and ran to the reporter to tell his mother that he had seen Fang's body washed up on the beach. The wife had already guessed the outcome, but in her heart she still hoped that her husband would return safely. Fang's body was soaked in water for a long time, so it looked terrible when it washed up on the beach. Fang's corpse was densely covered with sea creatures such as sea clams and conches. These often attached themselves to dead bodies in the sea. The people saw this and immediately helped clean Fang's body from sea clams and conch and brought his body home for burial. Those sea snails adhered to the skin of the decomposing corpse. When the people pulled the snail out with his hand, the snail would bring a piece of meat or skin from the corpse. The people made great efforts to help. People brought the body back to the village, prepared it for burial. Most people in shipwrecks died in such a tragic way. Sea clams and conch were removed from Fang's corpse still on the beach. After dark, a group of young people was walking by the beach. The sea was extremely cool but contained many dangers and death. These three young people all worked in town and turned back to the village at night to rest. That day they invited each other to go out to relieve stress. One of the groups, Han, found the sea clams and conches scattered on the beach. The group didn't know where the sea clams and conch came from, but these conches looked delicious. The rest of the group said, "These people are a waste. These delicious big conch are thrown here. This thing is a real bargain." So the whole group packed those snails and prepared them to bring home to cook and eat. The group did not forget to laugh happily because they accidentally caught delicious bait. The sky suddenly became pitch black, and clouds were gathering in the evening. The houses near the sea were quiet. The group went home to cook snails and make some small dishes, and then they started drinking. People lived near the sea that had one thing in common. They knew that the meat of this conch was very tender and juicy. This conch was large and had lots of meat. The young men pulled out the snail meat with a small toothpick. The snail was completely separated from the shell. The appearance was a little scary, but the meat was delicious. The conch was an expensive food in the city. Therefore, these young people couldn't ignore the immediate benefit. The group of young people used toothpicks to get the snail meat and ate happily. They looked like they were eating well. But only Han didn't eat any snails. "Why don't you eat it?" a young man asked Han. "I'm allergic to snails, so I can't try. You guys just eat it. I was scared when I looked at it," Han said. So the two remaining people gossiped and quickly ate all the conch. After eating, the group went to bed because it was past midnight. Because three young men were tired and had a little yeast in them, they slept soundly. Han also quickly fell asleep because he was too tired. Just sleeping for a while, Han was suddenly woken up by terrible screams. He still couldn't figure out where these screams were coming from because he was still sleepy. It turned out that one of his co-workers was sick. But isn't he sick? Han saw that person writhing in pain, his whole body arched, his whole body covered in a deadly gray. His stomach felt like something was moving. His belly was gradually bulging high, bulging like a pregnant woman. His belly was constantly expanding, the underbelly was twisting back and forth, looking very scary. Han was frightened by the sight and immediately went to his friend's bed to help him. At that time, there were also screams of pain from behind. Han wondered what had happened again. Han looked back. His other friend was also in great pain, to the point of kneeling on the bed. His whole body had blue veins, so painful that he gnashed his teeth as if he couldn't stand it anymore. Han did not dare to delay when he saw the situation. He immediately ran out to find a doctor. After a while, Han found a doctor who had been working in the village for more than 30 years. When the doctor arrived, Han's two friends passed out from the pain. The two of them looked like they were dead. Han looked at them with fear. The doctor said they had eaten something unclean. That was why it happened. Han told the doctor about these two eating the conches tonight. "We picked up some conch and mussels today. The two of them ate them," Han told the doctor. After listening, the doctor told Han about the terrible origin of those conches. Han's face paled from fear. The doctor said that conch and mussels were the things that contained the evilest spirits in the sea. They like to suck the yin gas of the dead. If we eat them a lot, they would be very harmful to our health. After that, the doctor went to get a bunch of sticky rice to soak in water. This way was a cure for conch poisoning. The doctor asked Han to give his water to his friends to drink so 2 friends could recover from their illness. After being poured a lot of sticky rice water into their mouths, the other 2 started vomiting madly. The scary thing was that the spit out conch meat was not completely digested, still intact with the shape of the conch. In ancient times, it was believed that conches and sea mussels could absorb yin and form pearls. Most sea snails and mussels were not very clean creatures at all. This terrifying event happened to my buddy Ben when we were in high school. We were also very close, so we frequently went out together. That day, Ben invited us to his house to play, but we were all so terrified to go. Just thinking about it gave me and my friends goosebumps. But when we heard that his family had recently purchased a new video game console, we forgot about our concerns. We were astonished and delighted to know that we would be able to play a new gaming console, so we immediately agreed and rushed each other to Ben's house. At the time, all of our families were farmers, and Ben's family was the wealthiest. His father frequently bought him many excellent toys. Ben even advised us on the way that we should approach his house through the rear entrance because some things might terrify us if we went in through the front door. I was concerned when I asked him whether his father slaughtered wild animals to soak wine. That was a little harsh. Hearing this, Ben voiced his disgust with my demeanor, stating that it was his father's profession, and that the more wild creatures that were drenched in alcohol, the higher the price they would sell for. Seeing that, we chuckled at the story and gradually entered Ben's house, and what made us not dare to go to Ben's house to play was his father, who worked as a brewer in a frightening style. The powerful odor of alcohol strikes the nostrils when the door was open, but something else drew my attention. It wouldn't be so frightening if Ben's father simply produced conventional wines, but he also produced wine from wild creatures. The wild animals were captured alive, placed immediately into the wine jar to drink the wine, and then drowned and perished, including snakes, pangolins, and monkeys. Ben's father even took owls and large geckos to soak in alcohol, and these wines were sold at exorbitant prices to the metropolis. After glancing around for a while, I got the impression that those wild white eyes were looking at me pitifully, which terrified me enough to close my eyes. But once we saw the gaming console, we forgot about our fears. We had a great time that day and nothing bad happened. That helped us gradually get used to it all and stop being frightened of it, so we began coming to Ben's house more often. That day after school, we went to his house again, and there were a lot of people in front of Ben's house, surrounding it. It turned out that Ben's father had captured a very huge cobra, and it appeared that he wanted to soak it in wine. It was the first time anyone had seen such a large snake, and it was found deep in the forest, so everyone was intrigued and drew it back to examine it. The cobra glared angrily at Ben's father, and everyone warned him to be cautious with large snakes like these. Then, as Ben and I went by, his father was ready to begin soaking the cobra in a jar of wine. Seeing everything made me a bit terrified, but then I started playing the game and forgot about the snake. Strange things began to happen all of a sudden. Ben's character froze and no longer moved. When I saw that, I turned to question him and saw Ben with his head down, making little coughing sounds. Then Ben's face turned purple and he coughed harder. His eyes were white and his mouth was full of water. He began to choke. His lips continued to spew something murky yellow, and I began to detect a strong alcohol odor from him. It turned out that what came out of his mouth was booze, not water. I became increasingly scared and I was at loss on what to do. Then Ben collapsed on the ground, his body splayed out as though lifeless. He was twisting and turning on the floor like a snake, wine still flowing out of his lips non-stop, and the image in front of me was horrifying. Ben appeared very weary after a time, laying on his back and motionless. I dashed to the yard to inform Ben's father because I was so terrified that I couldn't talk coherently. Ben's father had just finished soaking the snake at this point, so he was still quite pleased, and seeing me terrified, he had no idea what was going on. I was now staring at the snake in the wine jar. It looked just like Ben. It also extended its jaws wide, became white in the eyes, and twisted its body. This was precisely what Ben was experiencing in there. I didn't comprehend what was going on. My mind was a jumbled mess, and I simply stood there. Ben's father came inside to see what was wrong with his kid at this time, and I was still standing there in terror. Everyone rushed inside the house. Ben was nearly unconscious with a lot of alcohol coming out of his lips. People surrounding Ben claimed he looked like a snake being drenched outside by Ben's father at the time. One of them also warned him that if he didn't release the snake, Ben would suffocate. When he heard that, he ran out of the yard and quickly knocked over the bottle of wine on the table, hoping Ben would live. The wine bottle shattered on the ground. Fortunately, the snake was still alive. It remained motionless for a while before waking up. It crept directly towards the pile of firewood to escape after calculating the direction. Everyone who watched the event that day, including me, was obsessed. Since Ben stopped vomiting as soon as the snake was freed, but did not wake up. Despite his father's efforts, Ben remained immobile. Seeing this, everyone urgently requested that his father bring Ben to the hospital in order to rescue him in time, as he was concerned that Ben would die if he continued to do so. Ben was classified as intoxicated at the hospital by the doctor because he drank too much alcohol. He slept for more than 2 days after that. I paid Ben a visit when he recovered consciousness and questioned him about what occurred that day and whether he remembered anything. Ben stated that while playing games as usual, he suddenly detected a strong odor of alcohol in his nostrils. Then, his entire body plunged into a large pool of wine. Struggling, but unable to swim, being further overpowered by alcohol. When he tried to look around, he discovered himself in a lake surrounded by translucent glass. When he looked out, he saw his father and many people laughing and pointing at him, as if Ben was shrinking. Ben felt the glass pane break just as he was ready to pass out from exhaustion and drowning in the water. Then I told him about the snake that his father had soaked in wine and left outdoors in the yard, looking precisely like what he had been doing that day. We were all terrified. Ben's father soon leaving the horror-brewing wine business too. It was the story I heard from Lao Lu in the village. He worked on the construction site. He cleaned the construction site during the day and helped look after it at night to avoid stealing steel and cement. That time, Lao Lu followed the team of engineers to repair the bridge in the evening. Lao Lu set up a tent and slept on the unfinished bridge. On weekdays, he ate dinner, drank tea and listened to the radio because he alone had no other pastimes. At 8 o'clock in the evening, he went out to inspect the construction site one more time before going to bed afterward. He turned off the radio, lit his flashlight, and went out to check. The bridge was only half repaired, no one crossed. On the construction site, there was also someone's sand and tools piled up, nothing too valuable. Lao Lu looked at the front and back with his flashlight. When he saw nothing happened, he thought everything was probably fine. He returned to the tent and prepared to go to sleep. But when he opened the tent door, he heard a woman crying behind him. Lao Lu wondered if he had gone to check and found no one. So why were there women crying? He looked in the direction of the sound to check. He discovered something very shocking. As mentioned before, the bridge has not been repaired yet. Only half of it has been repaired. There were still some bridge piers on the river that had not been connected to the bridge body, but at this time Lao Lu saw a woman crying on the middle bridge pier in the river. At first, Lao Lu was also taken aback. After that, he calmed himself for a moment. Then he looked at it with a flashlight and wanted to ask this woman how to get to the pier. But he was surprised when he used the flashlight. The woman on the bridge suddenly disappeared and the crying stopped. Lao Lu thought that maybe he had seen the wrong thing with these blurry eyes, so he turned off the flashlight and went back to the tent. The next day, while everyone was having lunch, Lao Lu told the story of last night to the workers. He started telling the story and everyone was listening attentively. As soon as Lao Lu mentioned a bizarre story last night, the workers gathered a lot and asked him what he had seen. Lao Lu vividly recounted how he saw a woman crying on the jetty. Lao Lu pointed everyone to the pier that was lying there. This river was deep. It was difficult for ordinary people to climb up to the jetty in the middle of the river. The workers felt that Lao Lu's words were absurd. Lao Lu, a construction guard, was alone at night on the construction site and saw a mysterious person. Or did Lao Lu meet a ghost? Some people didn't believe it, and some people thought that Lao Lu didn't seem to be lying. Then they all remembered the previous shipwreck in the river. It turned out that a few days ago a boat upstream they were under construction sank, killing 2 men and a woman. The 2 men's bodies were recovered, but the woman's body had not been found. Someone asked if Lao Lu had to see the ghost of the drowning woman. Although Lao Lu's description of the woman sounded similar to the victim, some people still thought that there was no ghost at all. The story went on like that all day. In the evening, Lao Lu inspected the construction site as usual and did not hear the woman's cry anymore, so he returned to the tent and fell asleep. But in the middle of the night while Lao Lu was sleeping, that crying came again, sounding lamentable and sad. In the stillness of the night he heard very clearly Lao Lu sitting up, groaning. He dressed quickly and took a flashlight out of the tent. He wanted to find out if he was dizzy. He followed that sound to go to the bridge. The night scene was scary and creepy. From a distance, Lao Lu saw a woman sitting on the opposite jetty, crying there, very distressed. Lao Lu gathered his courage and shouted at the woman he did not understand what he was doing. As a result, the woman jumped off the pier. This thing was strange. This thing scared Lao Lu. He wanted to rush to save people, but he was too far from the pier. He stood dumbfounded as he shone his flashlight on the pier opposite his eyes. The woman disappeared halfway after the jump, and there was no sound after falling into the water. Lao Lu used a flashlight to shine on the pier many times, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. At this time, Lao Lu believed that the woman was a female ghost. Early the following morning, Lao Lu found Master Lee, the contractor, and told him about seeing a female ghost. Boss Lee was not happy to hear that. He thought Lao Lu was spreading superstition and spreading false rumors. Boss Lee also said that if this affected workers' work, he would dismiss Lao Lu. Master Lee scolded Lao Lu a few times and then left angrily. Ignoring Master Lee, Lao Lu bought some underworld banknotes and burned them on the bridge after dark. It was that if you dreamed of a dead person, it was a bad omen. In such a case, you could burn some underworld banknotes. Lao Lu burned paper money for the female ghost on the bridge. It seemed to have really worked since that night. Lao Lu had not heard the crying for 3 days in a row, nor seen the female ghost again. On the 4th day, the workers began to pour the piers. At that time, the facilities were still poor. There were not many types of artificial machines like today. Workers poured the first layer of concrete and then waited for it to dry before pouring the next layer. The strange thing was that the bridge pier poured the day before. The next day it collapsed, so it could not be repaired for several days. The foreman couldn't help but report the strange incident to Boss Lee. Boss Lee suspected that the foreman had cut down on the materials, which was why this happened. The foreman was so scared that he swore he would never do such a thing. Boss Lee believed that the foreman said, but the pier still couldn't continue pouring concrete. Was it really haunted? When Boss Lee heard the word ghost, he reminded the foreman. Boss Lee didn't say a word, but he thought about something in his heart. First, he reprimanded Lao Lu for engaging in superstition, which was actually just to let the workers work in peace. Then he stopped the project for a day. The following morning, a small car ran up the bridge. Boss Lee especially invited Master Zhang to help him see the date and calculate feng shui. Boss Lee led Master Zhang to the bridgehead and showed Master Zhang the pier where the accident happened. Master Zhang looked at the pier and his expression changed. Master Zhang said as soon as he arrived at the pier, he felt overwhelmed with gloom. Master Chung said that the bridge might be entangled in some resentment, so it had been built many times without success. When Boss Lee heard about it, he panicked and prayed to his master for a way to solve the problem. Master Zhang asked Boss Lee if anyone had died during the construction of the pier, because he felt that there was a contractor with a dark heart. When a worker had an accident, he directly buried the victim's body with reinforced concrete. Boss Lee swore that there was absolutely none, and that he would not work so unscrupulously for the money. Master Zhang looked at Boss Lee and felt that he was not lying. Master Chung looked at the piers and said that the problem should lie in the water. Boss Lee hurriedly hired a good diver nicknamed the Water Rat, and at the same time found another boat and told the diver to go under the pier to check what was wrong. Lao Lu also joined the crowd, curiously waiting for the results. The diver rowed the boat out and under the pier alone. Everyone on the shore was also looking down. After taking a deep breath, the diver dived straight into the water. The sinking part of the pier was 5 or 6 meters deep, and the diver tried his best to dive. But under the pier he saw nothing but some gravel. He dived to the other side of the pier again, trying to see if there was anything unusual on the other side. But as soon as he dived, he was so scared that he choked on the water. He saw that some of the rocks under the bridge were cement blocks with many exposed steel bars. A woman's body was hooked by steel rods and hung there. The body swayed continuously in the water. The diver quickly surfaced, shouting to Boss Lee on the shore that there was a female body under the pier. Boss Lee selected 2 more diving workers from among the workers and promised to pay more to bring the woman's body ashore with the diver. Lao Lu also followed Boss Lee to see how things were going. The woman's body, despite being soaked in water for many days, still did not rot and swell but was soggy white with a lamentable expression. Master Zhang thought that woman didn't want to die, so her face was full of resentment. After being compared by the police, the female lead's body was the one who was not found in the shipwreck a few days ago. Boss Lee also spent a lot of money to let Master Zhang perform the magic. Finally, the bridge was completed and had been in use for many years. After hearing Lao Lu's story, I even went to see it. It was just that the symbols on the jetty have long since disappeared and were no longer visible.
The story I'm about to tell happened to a young couple who had just moved into an old, cheap apartment in the city to start a new life. Ever since they moved into this new apartment, Umi was having the same nightmare every night. Higo was a hard-working man. He usually worked until 1-2 a.m. as he needed extra income to support his home. One night, as usual, Umi was having nightmares. She woke up in the middle of the night, screaming and panicking. Higo heard the screams and worried. He hurriedly left his work and ran to Umi. He could tell it must have been a terrible nightmare from the sweat rolling down her face. This happened a few more times until Umi decided to go to the hospital to get examined, but the doctors were unable to determine the cause of the nightmares. Higo had started to become anxious and stressed because of his wife's suffering. He needed to know what the nightmares were about. Seeing her husband distressed, Umi took a sip of water, regained her composure, and began to talk. She went on to tell him she had dreamed that she was lost in a country. In that country, she met 2 people. The first one was a woman who looked a little over 40 years old, and the second person was a kid, about 6 or 7 years old. They both had gloomy faces. She proceeded to tell him that she approached them regardless. It was in her nature to help, even in her dreams. The woman, crying, told Umi that she had been kicked out and chased away from their home by her husband's family. Umi's expression immediately changed. She was angry and upset. Before she could ask the reason, she heard footsteps coming from behind. Umi saw the mother and her child turn pale. The mother quickly grabbed her child and ran away. Before disappearing into the distance, the mother looked back at Umi with a desperate expression on her face. Umi was confused. She couldn't see them anymore, and just as she tried to take a step, a group of people walked past her, and in the dim light she saw their horrible faces. They were pale, with the skin filled with blisters and sores and maggots coming out of them, just like zombies. Her voice cracked and then stopped. Her husband stood there, feeling helpless and impotent. Umi had always been a delicate and sensitive person. Deep down inside, she knew this was not an ordinary nightmare. But because she had her husband to reassure her, she dismissed them and managed to find comfort. The next morning, Higo resigned from his job. He went out and bought some cakes, and then went to see a friend of his who was a psychiatrist. When he arrived, Higo told the whole story to his friend. His friend listened in silence. After he finished talking, his friend seemed surprised. He knew there was more to the story. Despite him being a doctor, he had a hunch that what was happening had a supernatural underlying, perhaps an omen from the underworld. These were just speculations from the doctor, but Higo was desperate to believe anything, and so he asked his friend for a solution. The psychiatrist pushed his glasses back in place and suggested they should both go to the place she saw in her dream. And so they did. Higo and his wife booked the first train to the countryside, to the place she had seen in her dreams. After traveling for 2 hours, they arrived in the countryside. They were lucky enough to meet a couple of friendly farmers who pointed them in the direction of the house from Umi's dreams. Once they arrived, they noticed how old the house was. Most of the paint on the door had peeled off. It looked like it had been abandoned for a year or 2. The door was locked, and the house seemed empty. Umi and Higo went back, disappointed for not having found anything helpful, but still determined to solve the mystery. Higo kept on reassuring his wife that everything would be okay and that they would eventually figure it out. They were both walking home along the pier when suddenly Umi's eyes lit up. She had an idea. Umi suggested they should go talk to the neighbors to see what they could find out. Fortunately, the people in this place were welcoming and friendly, so they took them into their home. Umi and Higo were offered some tea. They both sat down, a little more relaxed and glad to be around smiley faces. It did not take long until the neighbor told them to ask her what they had come there to ask. And so, Umi did not hesitate to ask about the mysterious house. As soon as the house was brought up, the neighbors' smiling faces suddenly changed. Noticing the change of expression, Umi and Higo guessed that it couldn't have been anything good. The kind neighbor hesitated at first, but after a moment of silence, she agreed to tell the whole story. She told them about the son from that family. Apparently, he was a womanizer who spent his days deceiving woman after woman. The son's name was Zen, and he, one day, broke up with a girl named Kara that he had been seeing when he found out she was pregnant. Desperate and heartbroken, Kara went to Zen's house, hoping that his parents would sympathize with her and talk some sense into their son. She was received with insults and curses. Zen's parents chased her away. Defeated and sad, she held her words back as tears poured down her eyes. But Zen's parents were unfazed. They pushed her and told her to leave. Thinking that there was just a misunderstanding, Kara tried to explain that the child in her womb was Zen's and asked them for support. But the more she talked, the angrier and more aggressive they became. They threatened her to leave, or else. Then, without a trace of shame, they pushed the pregnant woman out of the door. Despite receiving terrible curses and insults, Kara tried to stay strong. She had to be now. That night, Kara stood outside their house, banging and begging to Zen's parents for help. And yet, they did not care. To this day, the villagers remember vividly the cries of that woman. By midnight, the crying had stopped. Kara was exhausted. She left, walking disorientated. Kara walked for a while when it started to rain. The rain started to pour down hard. She had nowhere to stay, and mad from the disappointment, she just kept on walking. She cried and cursed at the man that brought her such misfortune, but not without taking on the blame herself as well. How could she have been so naive to trust someone that much? Some say they saw her walk into the forest. For what reason? One can only guess. The next morning, the people from the village had gathered at the bottom of the cliff, Zen's parents included. That morning, someone had brought the news of a pregnant woman that was found dead by the cliff. To no one's surprise, it was Kara. She lay there, dead, but with her eyes wide open and with an angry expression. The villagers didn't take long to come up with rumors about her death, and so Zen's family buried her body deep into the forest and then fled from the countryside. Higo and Umi listened perplexed. What they had heard confirmed to them the cause of her nightmares. They said their goodbyes and went on to search for Kara's burial place. After a while of wandering in the forest, they stumbled upon a rising mass of ground. They figured this was the place, even if there wasn't a tombstone. The next day, the couple brought some monks to chant and bless the place to allow Kara to transcend to the next realm. They also carefully cleaned up the area and set up a tombstone for Kara. Once the rituals were completed, Higo and Umi felt at ease. They lingered for a while longer there, taking their time to talk to Kara and her daughter, or at least what was left of them. After that day, Umi no longer had nightmares, but what transpired that one fine day never left her.
It occurred in the spring of 2001, and it became a very well-known story that year. There was a very wealthy family in the village, and the oldest son, Shen, celebrated a big wedding with a village girl named Lan. The wedding was grand and crowded, with many attending to bless the bride and groom. The groom's friends began to tease as well, as if it were a ritual before allowing the two to get into the wedding room for consummation. On the bride's side, some friends and bridesmaids had come to celebrate, So they took advantage of the opportunity to chat with the bride before she officially joined her husband's house. At first, it was just a fun conversation, but then Shen's friends began getting drunk and making fun of the groom, which became increasingly outrageous. They were no longer teasing only the bride, but rather the bridesmaids, who were also in the room. They also forced her to make some pretty subtle jokes. Everyone was drunk at the moment, so the bride couldn't stop the groom's friends. But just as everyone was making a lot of noise, a friend of the bride who was also a bridesmaid at the wedding burst out of the next room. People didn't understand what was going on when they saw her crying and screaming and fled quickly. Her name was May. She ran out of the house before anyone could ask about the situation. Her clothes were strewn about, and her hair was a mess. Everyone was still stunned, but inside the room a friend of the groom was Wu. His face was red, possibly from inebriation. He was not wearing a shirt and was still holding his pants, and he was also perplexed. Wu appeared to have had a bad intention towards May when he saw her sleeping in the bride's room while being drunk, causing her to panic. The bride was furious and scolded him. Everything was serious, but Wu still believed that it wasn't as exaggerated as the bride claimed to be. He was simply drunk, and he blamed May for lying in that room with such a revealing dress on. Hearing this, the bride became enraged, chasing May while turning around to curse Wu. Because May was getting married next month, Wu's actions would jeopardize her honor. Following that, both the bride and the groom dashed out to find May, afraid of that something bad would happen to her while running out this late. May, on the other hand, ran quickly to the forest. She was a very sensitive person, and Lan was afraid that she would have done something reckless. So Lan enlisted the help of everyone to find her. Everyone then raced to find May. This area was quite dark and large, and the longer it took, the more worried Lan became about her friend. People looked for her for half an hour, but couldn't find her. Everyone was talking about going deeper into the forest. After a while of searching, there were results, but what they saw in front of them caused everyone to panic and bewilder. May hanged herself on a tree branch with only her lingerie on, possibly because it was too humiliating and made her consider suicide. Everyone was terrified when they saw the scene. In the dark night, a flashlight flickered, casually shining directly on May's face, revealing the terrifying face of a hanged man, tongue sticking out, eyes open wide and full of blood veins, looking extremely terrified. That angry face and eyes seemed to be looking directly at Wu, who had just done bad things to May. Following that, Wu was arrested for the crime of indirectly causing death and causing mental damage to the deceased's family. However, having lots of relationships and bribe money, he was released the next day because they thought May purposefully committed suicide, which caused outrage among the villagers, but he didn't care and went straight home. It rained heavily that night, and despite the fact that he raped May, he had a wife. His wife began questioning and blaming him as soon as he returned home. The two had a heated argument. The wife couldn't accept his behavior and accused him of being such a terrible man. His parents couldn't stand up for him in this situation. All they could do was give up as they watched the couple squabble. The wife was sobbing while talking, but he neither seemed to mind nor felt bad about it. The more she talked, the more irritated he became, and his wife couldn't take it any longer, so she proposed divorce. He agreed right away, without hesitation. His parents, who were standing outside, were equally impatient and concerned because divorce was no minor issue. If they divorced, it would be extremely difficult to find a new husband for her. However, according to the father, it was his fault, not his wife's. Everyone in this village realized he made a terrible mistake, so no one dared to be with him. His parents heard rash voices continuing from inside the room while he was worried and confused. They thought Wu and his wife were arguing again, so they peered into the room through the glass to keep an eye on them. They only saw the daughter-in-law sitting on the bed. Holding her head with both hands, her mouth muttering something inaudible, and she looked like in great pain. They assumed it was because Wu had beaten his wife. Otherwise, why was she holding her head in such pain? But when they looked closely, they panicked. The wife's entire face began to change, becoming strange and frightening. Her body turned pale, her face was green, and her tongue was protruding over her chin. She approached Wu with a resentful expression. Wu had also begun to doze off at this point, so he had no idea what was going on behind his back. His parents stood outside, being aware of that something was wrong, and attempted to wake up Wu by banging on the window. Hearing the noise, he began to roll over, but his eyes remained closed. The wife was now very close to Wu. It was too late by the time he could wake up and open his eyes. His wife was standing right next to him, looking at his wife's face now. He immediately remembered May's face when she was hanged to death. His parents were also eager to enter the room to assist their son, knowing that the wife has been possessed by May. They were nervously screaming, knowing that this was the ghost coming back for revenge, which usually never ended well. So they burst in through the main door and dashed inside the house to the couple's bedroom door. The father tried repeatedly banging on the door and calling out his son's name, but there was no response from the inside. After several attempts to bang on the door without success, the father decided to use force to smash through it. Fortunately, the door was made of wood and was relatively thin, so they were able to get inside after a few hits. However, the scene in front of them caused them extreme panic. The Wu couple was currently on the bed with large puddles of blood splattered all over the room. The mother cried pitifully. Looked like Wu was stabbed and cut by a sharp knife, and the wife passed out on the bed, still clutching a large knife. The two rushed Wu to the hospital, but even if he arrived quickly, Wu would not be able to survive due to excessive blood loss. The news of Wu's death quickly spread throughout the village, and almost no one sympathized as a result, believing that this was the retribution he deserved. People usually come to help at funerals or weddings in the village, but no one did this time. Instead, they stood outside, curiously. After that, the mother went insane and spent her days wandering on the streets looking for her child. And the wife was imprisoned. While being there, she went insane because she couldn't remember why she had killed her husband in such a way. After graduating from college, I was able to find a job. It was an old psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. This hospital was already too good for me based on my average graduation score. The work there was also relatively easy for a beginner like me. But a close friend of mine told me that there was a murder at the hospital last week, and it was rumored that the doctors were responsible for torturing a patient to death. But the hospital kept the case hidden because the female patient had no relatives, so no one was prosecuted. In the early days of my job, I frequently arrived home late from work. My colleagues Kai and Song also assisted me greatly. They were doctors with several years of experience. Kai abruptly asked me after changing clothes if I had heard rumors about patients being tortured to death in this hospital. I also responded honestly about what I heard earlier, which I didn't mind at all. We also began to walk down the corridor to leave, while the two of them continued to discuss the rumor. I could hear what seemed to be a female patient. On the way to the main hall, the clock bell suddenly rang so loudly that I almost fell over. So Song began teasing me, because as a doctor, I would be required to work at night so frequently, but I was still so nervous that even the sound of the bell startled me. Kai then looked at his watch and told me, somewhat solemnly, that I needed to hurry up so that I could leave the hospital as soon as possible. When Song heard that, he turned and walked quickly, and I sensed their urgencies and a little bit of anxiety. I didn't know why, but they appeared to be afraid of something, perhaps because the hospital at night was too creepy. I didn't think much either, and was about to turn around to follow them when a cry from back of the hallway caught my attention, and I turned to look, because there was no patient's room near the source of the crying. When the other two heard it and turned to look, I asked if there was a patient room on that side. I was afraid that if a patient went out of their room inadvertently like that, it wouldn't be anything good for them. However, as soon as I asked, the two of them stammered and made scared faces, claiming that they didn't hear anything and that I must have misheard. I didn't think so, but since they didn't believe me, I offered to go into the hallway to double check and told them to go ahead or wait for me to return. Song stopped me just as I was about to leave, telling me to ignore it and go home. It was now too late to go back there to check, but it wouldn't be too late to come early the next morning. Hearing this, I wasn't sure why I was so enraged, because I believed they were doctors with many years of experience, but they didn't seem to really care about their patients, which disappointed me. So I ignored their words and walked alone in the hallway. The other girl's cry grew louder. I was just afraid she was stuck somewhere and couldn't get out, and the other two stood there looking at me without saying anything. Following the cry, I arrived in front of a room which I normally saw but never entered because the staff in the hospital said it was no longer in use. I opened the door to have a look. There was no light inside. It was dark as ink. Only the moonlight shined in through the window. There was no one inside, and the furniture was covered in white sheets, and there was one rocking wooden horse. The crying had stopped, and I wondered if I had been misheard, so I quickly turned around to close the door and go home. But two black shadows appeared from behind me, causing me to scream in terror. It turned out to be Kai and Song. The two of them seemed to have some humanity. Seeing that I had been gone for a long time, they decided to come check it out. Seeing me startled, they were also a little amusing. Then they asked if I had found the patient and where the crying was coming from, but I told them that I hadn't seen anyone on the way. There was no one in the room as well as the crying had stopped, possibly because I was too suspicious. Seeing this, they urged me to come back because it was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. I was also struggling to turn around and close the door before going back home, but then I noticed something that stunned me. The rocking horse I saw earlier in the room was swaying automatically without any wind impact, and the scary thing was that the silhouette of a person sitting on the horse reflected on the floor in the dim moonlight. After a while, they didn't see me behind them, so Kai and Song turned to look for me, and they saw me still standing like a statue at the door of the room. So they called out to me, and this was when I began stuttering about the strange object in the room. The two others turned to have a look as well, and when they saw what was going on, they turned pale and sweaty, as if they were hiding something. There was no more crying, only a very creepy laugh, and my body trembled with fear. At the same time, Kai quickly turned away, not forgetting to urge us to leave as soon as possible. Unexpectedly, Song did not follow us, but instead turned completely towards the room, his body stiff as if controlled by something, and gradually entered the room, much to our surprise. At this point, a woman appeared next to the rocking horse, and I could feel tremors emanating from Song's body. His face was also terrified but unable to resist. Song quickly approached the other woman. It was clear that Song knew about her because as soon as he saw her, he begged her to spare his life, claiming that he didn't hurt her intentionally. Her face was also visible in the moonlight. I could see her pale white skin and deep black eye sockets devoid of pupils. She was clearly not in the form of a human. Kai also started screaming in panic, begging her to forgive him. Was she the patient who was tortured by the doctors and the rumors? Before I could figure it out, Kai turned and ran away. I tried to call him back to help Song, but he didn't care, maybe because he was too scared. I saw Song, on the other hand, moved his body for a while to resist, but once he could escape from the overpowering, Song quickly turned around and ran away from the ghost. But the door was controlled by a supernatural force, and as soon as Song ran to it, it slammed shut, separating me and Song. There was no way I could open it to save him. Song screamed in vain, and I continued to try to open the door. At this point I was still unaware of the danger in front of us, and I had no idea what was going on in the end. The ghost was gliding behind Song, a strange smile on her lips, and she was whispering something to Song that I couldn't hear. But Song seemed to panic, and he turned back quickly, looking at the ghost. His tears streamed down his cheeks, and his mouth was constantly begging for forgiveness. The ghost appeared out of nowhere, drew out a sharp iron needle, smiled sinisterly, and said, "Enjoy the pain of being stabbed by this needle." Despite Song's pleas, she approached him and began repeatedly stabbing him, causing Song to scream in pain. When I saw that, I couldn't think any longer and simply turned around and ran as fast as I could, hoping to get out of here as soon as possible. Song's screams echoed hauntingly behind me, but I didn't dare to pause for a second. I kept running, but I couldn't seem to get out of this corridor. It had never been that long before. I came to a halt when I noticed a figure standing in front of me. I raised my voice to confirm who it was, because I was afraid the ghost would disguise herself as a human in order to harm me. But the familiar voice also asked who I was. Only now did I realize it was Kai. Why was he still here? He should have escaped from the hospital a long time ago, but he himself wasn't sure why he couldn't get out. Kai also inquired about Song's situation, and I informed him of everything. Kai appeared terrified. I purposefully asked why the ghost would harm people in such a way, but Kai dodged my question and refused to answer it. We couldn't get out in the end, so we decided to hide in a room. Inside the room there was a table covered in white fabric, so we hid under that table. We were muttering about how to get out of here when we noticed 2 white feet standing through the gap between the table and the floor. Kai was so terrified that he covered his mouth with his hands to avoid making a sound, but she might have noticed us because she was cursing. When the table was knocked over, Kai and I both panicked, tears streaming down our cheeks. She pointed her finger at Kai's face and declared that anyone who harmed her would be held accountable for their crimes. Then she raised her clawed hands and rushed towards Kai as if she wanted to eat Kai alive. He was so terrified that he urinated in his pants while covering his face with his hands and refusing to look at the ghost. The ghost rushed over and tightly wrapped her hand around his neck, her face fierce and frightening. I sat next to her, my legs shaking, unable to move. I closed my eyes and ears, hoping it was all a dream. Kai was unconsciously lying on the ground. I wasn't sure if he was dead or alive. The ghost turned to look at me. Would I meet the same dead end like them? But in the end, she didn't do anything to me. Perhaps because I was innocent. The ghost stared at me for a long time before slowly vanishing, leaving Kai and me in that cold room. I was so terrified that I fainted right away. The next day, all 3 of us were taken to the hospital. Neither of us were seriously injured, and I also reported the incident to the police. Following that, the police thoroughly investigated the case. Song and Kai, as well as some related people, were all summoned to the court to receive their sentences, and I resigned immediately after being discharged from the hospital, which seemed like a nightmare to me, a nightmare that I would never forget. The story I'm about to tell is about someone from my village. The house belonged to the Wang family. The husband's name was Wang Taozi, and he has been married for over 10 years with 2 young children. The couple was not harmonious, arguing over small things for 3 days and over major issues for 5 days. Everyone in the village knew about their troubles, and they were used to the noise in the house. And the family tragedy began when the 3rd person appeared. You can only sympathize with the wife who cried her heart out because her husband was having an affair, but she couldn't do anything about it. In terms of appearance, the woman named Lu was more attractive than Taozi's wife. Women outside felt sorry for Taozi's wife, but most men who didn't love their wives believed that the beautiful woman like Lu could easily captivate a man's heart. Wang Taozi didn't know how much he loved Lu. No one in the house, young or old, could convince him otherwise. He decided to leave and no longer wanted to live with his wife. Even though the 2 children desperately pleaded, "Daddy, please don't go," it couldn't change his mind. He didn't care at all about the 2 children. That time, after a quarrel with his wife, he angrily left without ever looking back. Afterwards, Wang's wife took the 2 children to her mother's house and asked her to take care of them. Unable to overcome this despair, the wife went to the village's river and threw herself into it. Within a day, the 2 children suddenly became orphans, with their father following the younger woman and their mother sadly passing away. Less than a month after their mother's death, joyful news spread in the house. That day was Wang Taozi's wedding day. He married the woman named Lu just 1 month after the death of his previous wife. He didn't even want to mourn his late wife. But life was not as peaceful as he thought after marriage. Lu always saw the 2 children as a burden, and she constantly beat and scolded them, even though they didn't do anything wrong. She was incredibly cruel to the 2 children. The 2 children always had to endure beatings under the cruel hands of their stepmother. Although they had a father, the 2 children couldn't rely on him. They had to endure their stepmother's mistreatment, even during meals. Every time they thought of their mother, the 2 children cried their hearts out. When they saw Wang coming home from work, the 2 children cried, covering their faces and telling him about their aunt's beatings. But Wang showed no pity and criticized the children, saying they deserved to be punished. He said it was their mother's job to discipline them, and if they were not taught, they would become spoiled. That was something she had the right to do. He also said that if they were at fault, they should take responsibility for it and then kick them out to think for themselves. Both siblings suffered injustice and didn't know who to talk to. The younger brother immediately suggested finding their mother because he missed her. After that, the 2 siblings held hands and went to the cemetery to visit their mother. They knelt before the grave, feeling sad and crying profusely. Their longing for their mother couldn't be expressed in words. They didn't know where to pour out their sorrows, so they could only speak to their mother. While they were talking, a small gust of wind passed through the cemetery. Then, the gust of wind surrounded the older sister twice, and suddenly she stood up. Her expression became more serious and firm. She didn't say anything, but suddenly she tightly grasped her younger brother's hand. Then, she pulled him along without saying a word, leaving her younger brother bewildered. They walked home hand in hand, not uttering a single word. The 2 siblings entered the house together, and at that moment the stepmother was still angry, and when she saw the 2 of them returning, she immediately started scolding them harshly. Noticing that the 2 siblings were covered in dirt, Lu grabbed a broom intending to continue the punishment. But unexpectedly this time, the older sister displayed great strength and decisively snatched the broom from the stepmother's hand. The stepmother was taken aback by a strong resistance. The elder sister wielded the broom, striking the stepmother repeatedly, just as Lu had beaten the younger sister before. The stepmother's face was marked with injuries and she screamed for Wang to intervene. Seeing this, Wang stepped forward, took hold of the broom and tried to restrain his daughter. But to his surprise, his daughter displayed remarkable strength and broke free from Wang's grip, rushing to strike the stepmother relentlessly. No matter how the stepmother begged, the girl wouldn't stop until the broom was broken, reduced to a useless stick. The stepmother was left lying on the ground, unable to get up. She looked at the weak and helpless girl who had transformed into someone else with a bewildered expression. As the broom broke, the girl suddenly collapsed on the ground, unconscious and unaware of what had transpired. News quickly spread and people believed that the girl's deceased mother had borrowed her daughter's body to return and teach the wicked stepmother a lesson. Eventually, the two children continued living with their grandmother. This story happened in a small town in the 1950s. The story was told by my grandmother to my mother. Now my mother told me the story again. At that time, the life of the people in town was very poor. Their ideology was also very backwards. In the village, there was a family surnamed Lu. This family had only one son and one mother. Their life was not difficult, but for some reason, a son got married but couldn't have children. Today, we all know that the reason for no children could be on the husband or the wife. But back then, all responsibility fell on the wife. The daughter-in-law was constantly harassed and tortured by her mother-in-law. Mother-in-law every day saw her daughter-in-law as not pleasing to her eyes. She beat and scolded every little thing and didn't consider her daughter-in-law a person. Because the daughter-in-law couldn't have children, she wanted the daughter-in-law to get a divorce so that her son could get another wife. But rural women at that time never dared to think about divorce. In addition to washing her face with tears, the daughter-in-law could only endure every day. However, the husband was also not a good person. He saw his wife being treated like this, but not only did not know how to comfort her, but also spoke cold words. He listened to his mother and everything followed his mother to mock, punch and brutally abuse his wife. The whole village did not pity the daughter-in-law because the status of a woman at that time was still very low. At that time, my grandmother lived in the same neighborhood as the Liu family. Almost every day my grandmother saw the daughter-in-law's body purple. All were beaten by her mother-in-law and husband. The woman has only been married for a few years, but now her body has deteriorated like that. My grandmother greeted her several times but received no response. My grandmother had a bad premonition in her heart, and she didn't expect it to be the last time my grandmother saw that daughter-in-law. Because that night, the daughter-in-law committed suicide by drinking poison. In the morning, when the older woman saw that her annoying daughter-in-law had not woken up, she scolded a few sentences. The older woman did not hear the answer, making her even angrier. But when the older woman opened the door and non-stop cursed, the scene before her eyes made her startled, terrified, and stunned. The daughter-in-law was dead and sprawled on the ground in front of her house. Perhaps the daughter-in-law wanted to go outside the house before she died, but she couldn't because she was heavily poisoned. The frightened older woman thought that her daughter-in-law wanted to haunt her. Witnessing the scary appearance of the daughter-in-law, the older woman in her heart was really scared. From that day on, she didn't know if it was really the soul of the daughter-in-law or not, or because of fear, the woman kept getting sick all the time. Having no choice, the older woman had to invite a shaman from a nearby village to exorcise evil spirits. The older woman remembered and told the shaman about the daughter-in-law who was still alive without children, making her angry all day. The shaman told that as long as the older woman was willing to pay for him, he could solve this problem. After that, he instructed the husband to make a charm to ask for exorcism according to his arrangement, and in 3 days, the shaman would proceed to destroy ghosts. The husband also obeyed. He made 3 long nails and made a big cutting board from an old tree. In the evening, 3 days later, the shaman began to perform the exorcism ritual. The old shaman's method of reassurance used to suppress ghosts and drive away evil spirits was really cruel. The shaman asked her husband to join him and drove large iron nails into the hands of his dead wife. Long iron nails pierced the daughter-in-law's palm and were inserted directly into the thick board. This crucifixion prevented the daughter-in-law's soul from escaping the coffin. A longer iron nail was hammered directly into the daughter-in-law's head, looking very scary. Finally, a heavy cutting board was placed on top of the woman's body so that her soul could never be released again. In this way, a thin wooden coffin was used to place the poor woman's body in it, and it was immediately buried. The daughter-in-law was not placed in the Liu family's ancestral grave, but was buried in an abandoned cemetery to the west of town. After that, the Liu family went around looking for a matchmaker to get a new wife for their son. But finally, the Retribution came. After some time, the older woman contracted a strange disease. There was a ringworm on her hand. Not long after, the palm and the back of her hand became sore. In the end, 2 large holes were necrotic, exactly like the nail on the hand of a dead ex-daughter-in-law. She got the pain, itching, and discomfort. The older woman could not stand it anymore, so she gave her son some money and asked him to find a good doctor to visit her home. But the son did not care about the older mother's illness. He took that money to gamble. Usually the older woman managed money so that he couldn't get it. This time, having money was an opportunity for him to run wild. With money in hand, the son continued to plunge into the gambling game. After many times losing to the casino owner, the small amount of money that his mother gave him was quickly exhausted. After dark, he bought some herbs with the rest of the change back home to trick his mother. He even thought that when his mother died, he would be the new owner of the house. But while he was thinking about that, suddenly he tripped and fell down the cliff. He was stabbed through the head by a long tree branch and a large rock pressed on his chest, dying on the spot. He died in a pose like his wife was lying in a coffin made by him. The older woman waited, but did not see her son come back. Her condition got worse. In the end, she died in pain and loneliness.